Welcome everyone that's watching us right now on the Real News Network and everyone that hopefully is going to like and subscribe to our new YouTube channel for Burn It Down with Kim Brown. I want to thank everyone that was rejoining us perhaps from our stir crazy days where we have been in quarantine in broadcasting a talk show for several months. But now it's time to relaunch and reshape and take the conversation in another direction. So people are asking me, what does burn it down with Kim Brown means? Well, burn it down means that we need to cast fire on all of the things, all the oppressive systems and structures that are in place that prevent us from reaching our maximum potential as humans, okay? I'm not about to go on an Oprah tangent. What I'm saying is racism, ableism, sexism, misogyny, misogynoir, like all of these things that are fostered against us, capitalism, big one, the big C, capitalism, all these things we have to get rid of, y'all. And there are ways to do that. And a lot of it starts with a conversation, but a lot of people are out here already doing that kind of work. So this is what the premise of Burn It Down with Kim Brown is about. Like I said, I'm Kim. If you don't know me, that's okay. A lot of people don't know me. I'm a longtime broadcaster. I've been doing radio and television for almost 20 years. It almost is very weird for me to say that. I've done urban radio. I've done top 40. I've done talk radio. But my position here at The Real News, I think, is one of the most important ones that I've ever held because we actually get to talk about and dissect and dismantle a lot of the very pertinent issues that impact marginalized communities, like the communities I come from, like the communities I don't come from. But here is a safe space for us to not only share perspective, but share strategy in ways that we can get rid of this white supremacist system that has held all of us back, white people included, by the way. We'll get into that probably on another show. But just to give you a little bit of idea of what Burn It Down is about. So again, subscribe to us right here. This is brand new, and we're doing it for y'all, for the people. So, of course, it would be appropriate and fitting to have our very first Burn It Down with Kim Brown come the day after Indigenous Peoples Day. Now, it was marked across the country, a lot of positive demonstrations of Indigenous solidarity, Indigenous sovereignty. Dozens of Christopher Columbus statues have come down way before even yesterday, and that was hastened about by just the way that 2020 has gone. People took ropes and performance art and was tired of Christopher Columbus's shit. It took down his statues. And, you know, there are a lot of white Americans, by the way, who stand in solidarity with Indigenous people, with Black people, on the issues of Black Lives Matter and recognizing the importance of Indigenous sovereignty and making sure that the cultural genocide that has happened to the Native peoples of this continent does not continue. So part of the conversation we're going to have today starts with tearing down Columbus statues is only the first step. What are the next things that are important to either restoring land, water sovereignty to Indigenous people? The land back movement is something that's gaining traction, and other ways of resistance that is coming, and how we can most importantly ally. If you are not Native, for God's sakes, you need to stand with Native people on Native issues because chances are they impact you also. So without further ado, I want to introduce our panel. I want to also give you guys a quick tease because later on in the program, we are going to be speaking with Kentucky legislator Representative Attica Scott. We spoke with her on Friday about the latest developments coming out of Louisville regarding the Brianna Taylor case. We know that a grand juror has taken the unprecedented step of trying to speak publicly about the way that the information was presented to the grand jury rather. And we know that the Kentucky Attorney General, Daniel Cameron, has taken steps to try to hinder that in ways. So we'll discuss that with Representative Scott, also talk about her arrest. You know, she was charged with rioting. You think a state legislature is going to try to burn down a library in her own district or at all for that matter? Yeah, I'm looking forward to that conversation, so stick around for that. But like I said, first leg of this show, we're going to discuss the issues relating to Indigenous people, Indigenous Peoples Day, and why we need to just eradicate the whole heroic image or prototype of the conqueror, the European conqueror, the conquistador, all that nonsense. So join me as we welcome today to our panel. We have a great panel here for you today. Dina Gilio-Whitaker. Dina is a lecturer of American Indian Studies at California State University, San Marcos, and also an independent consultant and educator on tribal environmental issues. She is also the author of As Long as Grass Grows, The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock. We're also joined today with Sammy D. Donato. Sammy is a member of the Baltimore chapter of Baltimore Italians for Indigenous Peoples Day. Yes, not all Italians are fans of Christopher Columbus. This is a very important point to drive home. And joining us today from Southwest Detroit, Antonio Cosme. Antonio is a radical Indigenous economist and activist. He's also a beekeeper with Southwest Detroit. That sounds awesome. I want to hear about that, Antonio. Antonio is also an educator with the National Wildlife Federation and a gardener with Southwest Grows. Antonio organized with the Detroit Indigenous Peoples Alliance to end Columbus Day in the city and to remove the Columbus statue from downtown Detroit. And Antonio, my producer Jean-Vieve, tells me that back in 2015, that awesome photo of Christopher Columbus, the statue next to City Hall in Detroit with the axe in his head, that possibly could have been courtesy of you. So if that was courtesy of you, sir, we salute you. So thank you all so much for joining us today on this very, very important discussion, the day after Indigenous Peoples Day. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Dina, I actually wanted to kick the conversation off with you first, because we know that, I'm 42, right? So Columbus Day was a day we got off from school. It was a federally recognized holiday for about 80 years. And as of maybe the past decade, though I know longer than that, Indigenous people have been organizing and protesting against Columbus Day. But why do you think this awakening, so to speak, in the United States has happened over the past, I'm going to say decade, perhaps even longer than that, where there's more of a mainstream awareness that Columbus is probably not the kind of person that deserves his own holiday in the U.S.?
Yeah, first I'll say, why Pisnaxio Kui Squeeze Dina Gilio-Whitaker, and I'm coming to you from the traditional and unceded ancestral lands of the Hashiman people and Wanenu Band of Mission Indians here in Southern California. So in answer to your question, I would say that, the movement to abolish Columbus Day and to get rid of Columbus really is on a long trajectory of historic actions that I think it's probably fair to really trace it to the quincentennial celebration in 1992. And, that there was this whole big celebration nationwide that we're going to celebrate, all these centuries of, 500 years of, Columbus and this whole narrative. And that was, a global thing. It was a United Nations movement. It was certainly a big deal in the U.S. Under the Bush administration, in the initial planning stages of it. And at that point, you saw Native people really mobilizing. Of course, now we have, as of 1992, we have a good, let's say 35 years, approximately, 30 years of American Indian Studies as a major field of study for Native people alongside ethnic studies, especially coming out of the San Francisco Bay Area. And so I think it's a convergence of historic kinds of things coming together that laid that foundation and helped spread the awareness about why Christopher Columbus, who did not discover anything, he was wayward and lost and found himself in the Caribbean. Of course, he never set foot onto the North American or South American continents. but was in fact a slave trader. And so, like it's recontextualizing it all. So when Native people are able to control the narrative and tell their side of the story, that changes things. And, it's all about the way that we understand things in the US is all about who controls the narrative. So, and the reason that we have this whole, Columbus Day mythology is because it's the conqueror's narrative. And, so we need to put it all in the bigger picture. So it's Native people really taking the reins and saying, no, we're not buying it anymore. And it's incorrect. And we owe it to our children to teach them the true actual history.
Antonio, before I come to you, I actually want us to go to a video of, this is a compilation of just a handful of some of the Christopher Columbus statues that came down even before yesterday, but there were some statues that came down yesterday as well. Shout out to everyone in Portland, Oregon. It was an Indigenous Day of Rage in Portland, and we'll get to some of that footage in a moment. But before that, I want us to check out this compilation again of Columbus statues coming down during the summer. Let's take a look at that.
Now, tomorrow we'll be able to say we are still here, but he's gone. Yeah.
Man, that's what I watched yesterday on my day off. I don't know about y'all, but I sat around and watched Columbus statues being taken down. And I'm telling you, the entertainment value does not diminish for each time that I watch that. Antonio, as I mentioned at the top of the show, it's awesome that these symbols of hate, these symbols of genocide, these symbols of white supremacy are coming down. And it's not a small thing that these symbolic gestures are happening. But in terms of what the next shift is in order to understand what the fight for Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous land and water rights goes, where does this go from here after the statues get taken down? What is next on the agenda?
I think the entire United States has a deep reckoning coming, and we need to have a truth and reconciliation in this country. There's absolutely been no accountability. There's been no, it's erased. That narrative is erased from history, particularly the resistance of Indigenous people. And I think in order for us to move forward in a good way, we have to write the history and we have to tell our own stories as Native people, and demanding representation and demanding the things that are honored in public space to fall in line with our social values is one step. That's an important step and a necessary step to have societal wide value, ideology, and ideating. But for me, I'm working here in Detroit in the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe. I'm a Coahuiltecan and Boricua person up here, and I have some African roots in West Africa, and we can't just remember and think that Columbus's legacy is limited to Indigenous peoples. Columbus, before he sailed to the Americas, helped establish one of the most notorious slave forts in Ghana, now called the Elmina Castle in Ghana. And he really initiated the transatlantic slave system and began in Latin America the encomienda system, which later evolved into chattel slavery. And this is an important legacy that we have to think about and connect. Even just the legacy of him as a sex trafficker. I mean, they were trafficking 9-year-old girls to Europe to be sold for sex slavery. We have to think about all those legacies and think about the way that we're telling this history, because Native peoples and African peoples, their destinies are deeply intermingled. I think there's a really great equation that helps us understand racial formation and even economic formation in America. It's red lands plus black labor equals white gold. And the more we as folks can come together as the black and the red, as black indigenous people of color in the United States, we could connect with our ancestry, connect with our homelands, connect with our thinking. We can really begin to like reshape the values of this country, particularly as we become, a larger and larger percentage of this country. It's always been the movements that come from our communities that have like increased equality for everybody in this country and advanced justice as a society. And it's only been through our social movements. So this is just another moment for our social movements. And we have to look at the way that colonialism is paralleled in modern day economic systems. I mean, I'm in Detroit. We lost our democracy in 2012. We've been occupied by the suburbs, the suburban mayor. The 2008 financial crisis, which displaced 200,000 people's homes in the city. The financial company Quicken Loans, that was probably one of the more responsible companies, is now owns downtown, and they're buying up all the buildings and bringing in, young men from the suburbs to work in their online mortgage origination company. I spoke with a woman just a couple of days ago who they're processing hundreds of loans every day online, creating the next new bubble. That had a disproportionate impact on African-American people, and Detroit is the blackest major city in the country. So if we think about the way neoliberalism is neo-colonizing our urban communities, we can begin to draw even more parallels between the struggles of reservations, the struggles in the global South, and the struggles of Black and brown people in urban cities. And I think if we can really begin to tell those stories and connect those dots, we can then have the formation of ideas that could move us forward in a good direction.
Sammy, I know that you are our white representative on this panel today. We certainly appreciate you being here. And you are representing a group of Baltimore Italians who support Indigenous Peoples Day. And there was a really interesting piece in The Nation, I think it was yesterday, where they reported how Columbus was elevated as this American cultural hero of American exceptionalism in the late 1700s, simply because he was not British, right? Because he was an Italian, but sailed for Spain. He was somebody who was not British that gained this mythology stronghold in the U.S. and is just snowballed ever since. Why is it that you think that at least some Italians are so determined to hold on to Columbus for dear life, as if he is this cultural savior and representative of Italian exceptionalism? And why don't you feel that way?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, and it's good to be on this call with everybody here. I think that the story of Columbus represents, in a lot of ways, what the process of whiteness means, and how it is like a form of accessing power and continuing colonization as a process that continues and adapts as the history of this country continues. These colonization looks like different things at different moments in history. And I think it's not surprising that when Italians were trying to become white, that they looked to Columbus, because much like the founding fathers that Anglo white folks were looking to, they were the so-called founding fathers of the country. Christopher Columbus had a similar legacy of violence and racist violence. And so I think that a lot of Italians look to Columbus as being their ticket to whiteness, as a way to access the same violent legacy that the rest of this country has. And so I think that what we focus on a lot when we're trying to talk to our community and dismantle the idea of Columbus is both ideas at the same time. First, what he actually did, Columbus, and then the process of the creation of his memory that we're talking about in the 1700s and in 1892 when there was a first celebration of nationwide celebration of Columbus Day. That really there was this like creation of a memory of Columbus as being this ticket, like this free entry into American whiteness, where Italian immigrants were able to, you know, just to catapult themselves over over other classes and become the white oppressive class. And I think that's what the history of the creation of Columbus Day means. And I think that by dismantling the idea of Columbus Day, we can dismantle. That's one small step in dismantling the way that whiteness is constructed and dismantling the ways that some folks are allowed to access power in this country, while folks who have ancestral roots in this land and folks who were brought here and enslaved are denied access to participation as part of our community.
How are those conversations going, Sammy? Are people receptive to the facts, the historical accuracies that you and others are speaking to them about Columbus, or is there a sort of determination to hold on to this folk hero myth that Columbus has been lauded as being?
I think there's both. I think Baltimore is a really good representation, right? I mean, we first pushed the bill in 2016 to get rid of Columbus Day. And it was really widespread opposition within Little Italy. And at that time, Little Italy had a lot more sway in City Hall. And I think that in these past 4 years, a lot of the older Italians who are very, very much attached and have attached their own identity to the celebration of Columbus have kind of fallen out and lost their access to power. And so while some folks have been receptive to the idea, what I think is we're seeing is we're more able to take power away from the folks who continue to celebrate people like Columbus. And I think that's really the organizing we're pushing for, is how can we change people's minds, but more how can we shift power away from people who are determined to maintain a colonial legacy.
Guys, I want us to take a look at another video coming out of Portland, Oregon. And we know Portland has been a flashpoint for resistance and advocating not only for Indigenous land rights and water rights, but on behalf of the movement for Black lives. And yesterday was designated by some organizers as the Indigenous Day of Rage. And I want us to look at a video courtesy of the Oregonian. It's not just Columbus statues that got pulled down. It was some other folks too. Let's take a look at that. So you saw there protesters taking down the statues of Teddy Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln. And Dina, I wanted to circle back and sort of piggyback off something Antonio said earlier about how Indigenous people weren't the only ones harmed by Columbus, how he facilitated the slave trade and sex trafficking of children, amongst other horrible, horrible, injurious things to the human race. But also, you know, Columbus wasn't the only one who did Indigenous people dirty. And looking at these two past presidents, these statues coming down in Portland, I believe a Twitter contributor making comment under that particular video noted that on the same day that Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, that he also authorized the hanging of at least a couple of dozen, I believe they were Lakota men who were connected to an uprising against the United States government. So the government has long had a firm boot on the neck of the Indigenous nations from coast to coast. But I also feel at the same time, what has happened to Indigenous people as a result of genocide is part of the reason why America seem to be, as a whole, sort of numb to this mass death number that we have been experiencing with COVID-19. You know, over 200,000 people dead, and a good chunk of our countrymen and women really barely bat an eye about it. But I think it was the numbness that we have been conditioned about mass death that began with the Indigenous genocide. How when it comes to talk about reparations or paying the Indians back from what we have taken from them, the government, white supremacy, et cetera, I mean, there isn't even really a number that can be come up with. What is the best way for people to stand in allyship with Indigenous folks who are outside of that community? What can people who are non-Indigenous do to help advance the causes that Indigenous people are still resisting on behalf of today?
So, I mean, that's a really big question, and that's always the big question that I get asked. And it's complicated. It has a lot of different ways that it can be answered. But what we need to understand is the way that we understand the United States as what we call a settler colonial country. So yes, it's founded on mass death. And, you know, I mean, from the very beginning, we have this whole narrative that goes, oh, well, you know, most of the Indians died off because of the germs that the Europeans brought in, and they didn't mean to, but it just happened. And so this is a huge, one of the huge original sort of lies or spin jobs that's been done. And you still hear historians talk about that today. And it's only one small part of a much larger story. So this we talk about settler colonialism being this structure that is designed to eliminate Native people in order to make room for invading populations. And that really is the best way to understand. That's the way that we as Native scholars and intellectuals and activists really understand the United States today and where we fit into all of that. So what does that mean for the current moment? Like, you know, you'll often hear people say, well, you know, I don't know, I didn't do it. I didn't kill any Indians. My family didn't do it. You know, there's this automatic sort of distancing from that history. But the fact still remains that for everybody that lives in this country, no matter what race you are, no matter where you come from, you occupy lands that were stolen lands that were gotten through centuries of profound violence. And so even for somebody like me as a Native person who doesn't live in my ancestral homeland, I live in the homeland of somebody else, I am still a guest in those homelands. So what are my responsibilities to that community? Where do I stand? How am I accountable to that community? And I think it was Antonio that said it earlier, that there has not been an accounting, there has not been this reckoning. And that, I think, is the next big conversation in the US. We're having this collective conversation about anti-racism, in light of the most recent Black Lives Matter movement and the ongoing police killings of George Floyd, Brianna Taylor, and all the ones that we can name. But that's maybe only a beginning point. It doesn't end there. When you're talking about the United States as a settler colonial nation, Native people are not just a race of people. We are nations that existed since time immemorial on these lands, and that this violent white settlement brought upon us, the killing and the dispossession. And so what we can all do to understand or to become allies is to really understand your place in that. How do you benefit where you live, in whatever place you call home? How did you benefit from the murder and the disappearance and the maintained system of dispossession that the U.S. has done? And do you even know who the Indigenous people of that place is? So these are the questions. These are the next big questions that the United States needs to start grappling with, about what is your relationship to land, and how do you benefit from that genocide in these ways? And then we can start talking about how we can overturn that, which includes all kinds of things. If we're talking about decolonizing the United States, it's not really fully possible, because ultimately that would mean that everybody goes back to where they came from. And we all know that's not going to happen. But we also have to be willing to have the uncomfortable, difficult conversations about things like giving land back to the Indians, this whole land back movement. This is like sort of like the colonial unthinkable, but it has in fact happened throughout the centuries, even among this genocidal structure. It does happen that land gets given back. And so I also want to point out real quickly that reparations is really not the correct way to talk about how to do this kind of historical accounting with Native people. We have treaties. We have hundreds of treaties that our nations and our ancestors made with the federal government that guaranteed certain kinds of rights, like rights to territory and rights to remain the nations that we are. But we have, at the same time, an entire legal structure that is built to our demise. So these are the things that really need to be talked about and and worked out in very structural ways through not just the highest institutional levels, but again, going back to on the individual level, how we as individuals, benefit from this system of Native elimination.
I mean, there's so much to unpack out of that, Dina, because I think most people, I would imagine, who are non-Native and who have at least some sort of level of consciousness and understanding to what has happened over the course of hundreds of years on this continent to Indigenous people, understand that there has to be some sort of repatriation in some way. But Antonio, here we are in 2020. Most people got rent to pay, right? You have a job to go to, you have a family to feed. We are shackled to the confines and the structures of this capitalist system. So how does restoration to Indigenous people, how can that even work in capitalism? Or is that even possible under the structure that we are currently in? And if that's not possible, what are the possibilities?
I think as a society, before we can really begin to imagine the radical possibilities, we have to deal with the here and now and the sort of things that we're struggling with as a society. We don't honor water here. It's a private good in a lot of places. A lot of Detroit's bankruptcy crisis was related to the semi-privatization of that utility system. I think about the way in which Sheila Cockrell, elite Detroit politician, political family, during the water shutoff crisis, in the midst of the Flint water crisis as well, she said, if you guys want free water, you can go down to the river and get it yourselves. And it's this idea that so much of the landscape that existed here in the Americas before colonization has been utterly destroyed. The possibility of water systems to clean themselves have been eliminated in the Great Lakes because of the coastal wetlands have been eliminated. And that was a huge foodstuff for Native peoples. The manumin, or the Anishinaabes, wild rice, that was a big part of their tradition, and that's been eliminated. So I think we have to, inspecting the history and looking at the way the commodification of nature, the destruction of ecosystems, and the way that echoes through time is a really, really important place to start with, because it does reflect itself in the way that we engage. I mean, we are, again, I mentioned the word neoliberalism earlier and its relation to neocolonialism, but a lot of those treaties were dealing with things that were essentially public goods. Access to certain trees, access to certain hunting grounds, access to wild rice gathering here, access to the sugar bush over there for Anishinaabe peoples, access to good fishing. All of these treaty rights still exist, and the ecosystems that made those treaty rights meaningful have been destroyed. And if we're looking at what is the fundamental problem that unites all peoples across the globe right now, it's ecosystem destruction. It's climate change. You get a lot of people amped up and talking about like the destruction of the Amazon, the lungs of the world. What about the eastern woodlands? There was a forest that existed covering everything east of the Mississippi. And that was completely like a managed food forest by Native American people. So we can think about like readjusting our systems as a society to be in line with the values and the ideas. If we just thought 7 generations ahead, I mean, that's such a simple idea. Like we are thinking about next quarter's profits in this country, as opposed to how are my great, 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 great grandchildren going to be able to sustain themselves off the land here? And it's building a relationship with the land and the seasons and the ecosystems and reviving these things that's going to be an important and necessary step. And I mean, we got a lot to get over. I mean, you got like crazy QAnon people who are saying it's like Agenda 21 and the UN's coming to get us and the globalists are trying to rule the world when they're talking about trying to do more sustainable development. I mean, there's a lot of really important ideologies that we got to break through. I mean, they don't even believe their own science in this country, let alone like indigenous ecological knowledge. So those are some of the bigger things. But I also wanted to kind of talk about like this idea of like whiteness, because we are in this like white lash moment globally. We're in this moment where Trump is very much hung his hat and gotten into office. One, on like obviously like the economic collapse and the destruction of the middle class and all those things. That's for undoubtedly a part of it. Another big part of it is white identity formation. When you are losing your privilege, when you are losing your access, when you're losing your wealth, when you're seeing your communities like slowly slip away and be destroyed through poor economic policies and globalization, it's easy to like cling on to what little you have. And whiteness is that for a lot of people. I mean, America, in order for us to like change this country, we have to find Sammy DiDonato's and moderate white people who are willing to like look hard at their history and look hard at this country and see the economic thing swept under all of our feet, because there's not enough of us Native and Black and brown people in this country to like to create the change that we need. That we need white people to turn on their class, to turn on their people. And a big part of that is deconstructing white identity formation. It's obviously like a class hierarchy and a class structure. Like this ethno-nationalism thing, it's like in India, it's Hinduism. Sorry, I live in the hood. We drive crazy bikes over here. But in Iran, it's Persians. In Turkey, it's Turkic people. In every country, there's like an ethno-nationalist thing. As populations are dwindling, as demographics are having older and older people, as economies are being undermined, as populations are blooming in the global south, these people are becoming increasingly insecure and they're holding on to their ethno-identity. And that's kind of where fascism comes from. And that's like what's really on the precipice. Like that's the looming thing that this country this is like Western society has never dealt with. Its sort of like eugenics, fascist sort of agenda. And that's what's looming on the horizon and we need to look out for. And I really appreciate this conversation around deconstructing whiteness, because Christopher Columbus, Italians, it wasn't even a country when Christopher Columbus was around. It was Genoa. It was a nation state. And there were every European settler, every European group had their own discoverer of this land, whether it's Henry Cabot or there's a bunch of them. And it's all about the ideology. Humans attach themselves to narratives, and Columbus is a central part of a narrative, part of white identity formation. And what are you, European Americans, losing in giving up your ancestry for whiteness? Who are you not honoring? What languages and cultures and ideas and relationships with the land are you not acknowledging by assuming whiteness? And how are you dehumanizing yourself and your ancestors by adopting to this white nationalist identity and protecting this country and this land? And yeah, that's a big question for this country.
Oh, well, Antonio, you just brought up so many points. And Sammy, I'm going to kick it to you and you're going to bring us home on this, because the process of unlearning sort of what we have been taught in American public schools since we were children. I can remember being in the first grade and reciting a little limerick. Christopher Columbus, 1492, he sailed a continent and sailed the ocean blue. I don't fuck it up, but that's okay. But the point is that, we are indoctrinated with this idea of the colonizers from a very young age. And children in American schools are expected to identify the country that the so-called explorers came from, the lands in which they discovered, and to know these things, be able to rattle off these things. It's part of the cultural propaganda that American school children are subjected to. And, Sammy, sort of taking the step to deconstruct that, because as Antonio wisely pointed out, we're not elevating the Italian over the English in this respect. It's white, right? White European superior came from Europe and then discovered these so-called lesser lands, right? From the way that it's framed to the rest of us. How does that unlearning begin in white communities, especially when sometimes when presented with historical fact, white people can become defensive? And again, to echo what someone said earlier, it wasn't my family who did that. My family didn't own slaves. My family didn't discover America. So on and so forth. How can white people be made to understand historical facts and the repercussions generationally that have come from these events, and how it impacts us today, and why it is so important to get rid of them, to dismantle them?
Yeah, I think, Antonio, you hit it on the head, each part of it, right? The process of how whiteness is created as an explicitly violent identity. It really doesn't have anything to it aside from being an identity based on violence and supremacy. So I think that it is exactly it. It replaces other identities with a violent one. I think that the way to try and deconstruct that is both complicated, but at the same time simple. The same way we deconstruct anything is about understanding and reshaping how we understand our past, which is why changing things like Columbus Day is so important. I think by changing how we view our past can redefine how we see ourselves in the present and really allow us to imagine the future in different ways that we need to create it. Because I think, like we talked about, the path we're on right now is not going to lead us anywhere to a future that any of us want to live in. So I think that really our only choice is to re-examine our past so that we can really reimagine a future that is something that we can live in together. Because I kind of don't believe the answer. It's fundamentally about what a fascist solution is versus a solution for the future that's based on getting stronger by working together and viewing safety as something that we build by building trust. And so I think that re-examining and reshaping how we see our past is critical to that. I think that that's difficult. It involves a lot of growing pains. I think it also involves understanding when people are very much committed to seeing themselves as part of a violent white identity, and understanding when we can build with those groups and when we need to not try to build with those groups. I think part of what we're talking about, part of the rise of Trump and the fear of a brown planet is coming from that. And we just need to understand that there are more of us, that there are more folks who are willing to throw down. There are more of us who are willing to organize to try and build something better and organize. And I think that there's a lot of folks working on that. And I think that we need to realize who we can work with and who's not worth trying maybe to bring and who we don't need to. I don't think there's ever been change that's been without conflict. And so I think that's okay to sit with too. Yeah, I'm thinking just right now with what happened yesterday on the Atom land in the Southwest, where folks were shot with rubber bullets just for trying to protect their land and sacred sites from having a wall built on top of it. That's part of Trump's attempt to try and keep this country white. I think protecting and lifting up those kinds of projects are what we need to be doing right now. I don't think that, I don't think it's an easy thing, but I think that we're in a moment where we have a lot of powerful coalitions in front of us, and we just got to keep building.
I feel like it's almost unfair that we've run out of time because this conversation really could go on. My guess is for at least a few more hours because there is so much to unpack because there has been so much wrong that has happened to an entire nation, or as Dina rightfully points out, multi-nations of people over the course of several hundred years. So I'd like to invite y'all back for another stab at this because I feel as though we need to continue to have these kinds of conversations, especially when it comes to being centered around Indigenous issues in the best way for people who want to stand with Indigenous people to do so. So hopefully we can get you guys back. I want to thank our guests for joining us today, Sammy D. Donato, Antonio Cosme, and Dina Giglio Whitaker for joining us on the day after Indigenous Peoples Day, but for a very important conversation. Thank you all so much.
Miigwech.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Wonderful, wonderful talk there. Hey, we are getting a lot of comments in the comments, and I'm only going to read a couple of them really quick. Because we have to get to our conversation with Attica Scott, which I was really happy to have. Tommy Yo B says, history classes have always sugarcoated how this country was created and many atrocities fully ignored or silent about. Man, listen, imagine if you start telling the kids in like kindergarten, first, second grade that Columbus and Cabot and who was some of the other jack-offs coming from Europe settling stuff, that they were straight killers, that they were pedophiles, that they were child rapists. I mean, I think the kids would have a different perspective on colonialism. And perhaps that is the point entirely, to not tell them the truth so they will not think of this country as being soaked in blood from the Indigenous people that we stole this country from. I'm not going to say we, because Africans, we didn't steal nothing from nobody. But from the comments, Human Love Solidarity says the whole planet is a cemetery. Just the rich have tomb markers. Yeah, that's correct. So guys, we know that there are still lots of moving parts happening in Louisville surrounding the case of Breonna Taylor. We know that the Attorney General, Daniel Cameron, Republican, Mitch McConnell flunky, can we call him a Mitch McConnell flunky? I think that's safe. Impaneled a grand jury, seemingly did not present all the evidence to the grand jury, and the grand jury did not come back with charges directly related to Breonna's death against the officers involved. So, of course, people took to the streets, justifiably so. One of those people was Kentucky State Legislator Attica Scott. She represents Louisville and the surrounding area. Attica is about that action in a legal way, of course, I'm speaking. She was arrested last week, charged with a myriad of felonies and misdemeanors. Now, fortunately, she's actually about to tell us about what happened to her case. But this is a quick clip of her when she was released from jail after being arrested the night that the no charges were announced. Let's take a look at that.
Cheers and applause from a crowd of supporters who stood outside the courthouse in solidarity with State Rep Attica Scott.
They are trying to have power, domination, and control over our bodies and our voices, and we will not allow it. As my daughter Ashanti, who was arrested with us, often says, we do not move in fear. No. So these charges will not stop us. It will not stop the revolution.
That's right. So guys, as I mentioned, I spoke with Attica Scott this past Friday. We got into the latest of what's happening surrounding the case with Breonna Taylor, in addition to what's happening with her. So I'd like to welcome Attica Scott to Burn It Down with Kim Brown. We appreciate her being here.
Thank you so much, Kim, for having me. I appreciate you.
Well, first, there's a lot going on. We spoke with you a couple of weeks ago after Attorney General Daniel Cameron made the announcement that no police officers would face any criminal charges directly relating to Breonna Taylor's murder. And subsequent to that, people justifiably, righteously took to the streets to demand justice for Brianna and changes with the way that the criminal justice system and the police operate there in Louisville. So let's start with this latest development. As I mentioned, reporting by Tessa Duvall from the Courier-Journal, she did report on Friday that Daniel Cameron's office is trying to stay a judge's order granting an anonymous grand juror's right to speak out about the proceedings in the Brianna Taylor case. Now, this is a bit of switchery by the Attorney General because he did agree, after a judge's order, I believe, compelled him to do so, to release some of the grand jury transcripts, which detailed some of the information that was presented to the grand jury that led to a lack of charges directly pertaining to Brianna's case. What is the latest of this as you understand it?
Well, it's obvious, Kim, that the Attorney General is an utter and complete failure. When you have two grand jurors who want to speak publicly about him failing to present them with all of the options in front of him, it says to me that he has failed miserably in seeking justice for Brianna Taylor, that instead he has been an agent of the police and trying to protect the police. The fact that he wants a stay on a judge's order says to me that he has something to hide. And I believe we should all be concerned about that.
You know, Tessa Duvall, relying a little heavily here on Ms. Duvall's reporting, she went on to say—
She's good people.
Oh, good. Good to know. She went on to report via her Twitter account that the grand juror wants to speak freely about how Daniel Cameron's office handled the Brianna Taylor case, including evidence, witnesses, charging options that might have been presented to jurors. Now, Daniel Cameron still insists that grand jurors knew their rights. Part of the transcript in which Ms. Duvall also reports here, for example, one piece of evidence that the grand jury requested to see was body cam footage from that night. And apparently, Daniel Cameron was reluctant to show the entire spate of footage. And one grand juror was reported to have said that, we got time. They were apparently very interested and engaged in wanting to see this evidence. And it definitely seemed as though the Attorney General had his thumb on the scale of whether or not these police would be charged. I know you know Tamika Mallory, right? Tamika Mallory was in your city around the time of the initial announcement of no charges. And she gave a very stirring speech. But one thing that she read when she was, speaking to protesters was an excerpt from Daniel Cameron's speech that he gave, I believe, when he was seeking office to a fraternal order of police.
It says, "It is a great honor to receive the endorsement of the bipartisan Kentucky Fraternal Order of Police. To the men and women in blue, I pledge to be your advocate and your voice every day. When I first got into this race, I did so to bring focus to the public safety challenge of our lifetime, the drug crisis. And there is so much work to be done to fight this epidemic. I am humbled to have this endorsement, and as a chief law enforcement officer in Kentucky, I will work every day to make our communities safer and our families and citizens more secure." Half of that statement is from Daniel Cameron when he received the endorsement of the FOP, one of the most racist organizations that exist in America. I got time today.
When an attorney general makes a pledge to police, what are the chances that someone like Brianna Taylor, like someone like yourself, like someone who may have a negative, like the family of David McAtee, what are the likelihood that they're going to get justice when the attorney general has already pledged that he stands with cops? Where does that leave the Black community in Louisville?
We're very clear that he pledged his allegiance to law enforcement. We're very clear about that he had no intentions in serving in office and defending the people of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Instead, he was committed to defending the people who endorsed him, the Fraternal Order of Police. So that's why many of us were disappointed, but not surprised by his decision. And his decision was clear. He decided he would not be seeking justice for Brianna Taylor and that he never had any intention to do so.
Representative Scott, you have been on the ground, on the front lines, trying to advocate for justice for Brianna's family. In addition to being out on the streets, you introduced Brianna's law to the state legislature, a law that addresses many pieces of reform for the police in your state and in your city. But I wanted to talk about what happened to you recently when the charges were announced where one officer would be charged with wanton endangerment, but no officers charged with Brianna's murder. People, Louisvillians, I'm not sure what they call people from Louisville. What do you call people from Louisville? Tell me real quick.
You got it, Kim. Louisvillians.
Oh, nice. Okay, Louisvillians, yes, took to the streets righteously, justifiably so, to say that this was not good enough, this was wrong, this system needs to change and do better for Brianna. And you were filming on IG Live as you and a bunch of protesters were headed to a designated safe space. I think it was the Unitarian Church.
I want y'all to know they want to kill us. We're 4th and York. They want to kill us. We're 4th and York. We were trying to go inside, so they're setting us up.
Hold your hands looking nice. Hold your fingers out. There you go. Hey.
They're setting us up. We were going inside. They were setting us up, just so y'all know as you're watching. 4th and York.
So as you're seeing police beginning to surround you, can you please tell us what was happening in those moments before you were taken into custody? What were you doing? What were other protesters doing? And more importantly, what were the police doing and how were they handling and dealing with the crowd?
Thank you so much, Kim, for asking about that. It was an extremely traumatic experience, and many of us are still carrying the emotional and mental scars from that experience. We were walking to the church in my district, District 41, the district that I represent and serve, and we were going for sanctuary and service. Now, please keep in mind that just earlier that week, the mayor had asked houses of worship to be open to people who were needing solace and comfort after the decision, and that's what we were seeking. We were, first of all, police blocked us in to a parking lot. We couldn't get out. They put their armored vehicles in front of the exit and then a concrete block in front of the second exit. So they blocked us in. So we had to get out and walk to the church. It was only 3 blocks away. So we thought we were going to make it. It was before sanctuary. We walked past the library that we were accused of trying to burn down. Again, the library in the district that I serve, I'm one of its biggest champions. We were literally 100 feet from the church. Across the street, we could see it. We could almost touch it. And police yelled at us to turn around. And at the same time they yelled at us to turn around, Kim, I was confused because they started yelling, circle them, circle them. So I'm on the recording asking, what do you want us to do? Where do you want us to go? And then they pointed their guns in our faces, told us to sit down. And that's when they started tying our arms behind our backs, our wrists behind our backs with zip ties. Sat us on the sidewalk for nearly an hour. And when I asked what was happening, they refused, Kim. They would not tell me why we were being arrested. People in community and people across this country knew why we were being arrested before we did.
When you recounted that, I swear I just had a bad chill go down my spine. I mean, that sounds terrifying. And I know that you were with your daughter, and I know that the both of you, I believe, were charged criminally. And there's been some movement on that regard as well. You had felony charges. I think you were charged with felony rioting, of all things. Do you think the state legislature is out there? What did they think you were doing? Busting up windows at the library? Like, I'm very confused. I'm like, why did they charge you with rioting? Like, what in the world?
Kim,
describe to us what you were charged with and what has happened with your charges.
They charged us. They claimed we were trying to burn down the library. I mean, I was so confused. But I will say, Kim, I am also eternally grateful that within hours, before we were even released, the library's union, AFSCME, put out the most powerful statement to say we denounce these charges against Representative Scott. She would never do something like this. She has been our biggest advocate fighting for funding for us at the state level, has shown up and supported programs here. So, I will say, Kim, you got chills when I was sharing with you. My daughter and I, and everybody who was in with us, not one of us dropped a tear while we were being arrested or the 10 hours that we spent incarcerated. When I left that exit lobby and somebody showed me that statement, I lost it. Because to me, it's the people that matter. And when the people, the labor union members who work at that library said this is impossible, that I lost it. I was like, wow, thank you all so much for believing in me. But I will say that I was terrified for my daughter and her safety because I know how violent police can be. So I was less concerned about my safety and I was more concerned about her. Just because we know the police murdered Brianna Taylor, so none of us were exempt from their violence. And I think it's important, Kim, for people to know that Brett Hankinson, the person who was arrested for shooting into Brianna's neighbor's apartment, spent 32 minutes in jail. We spent 10 hours in jail for fighting for justice for Brianna Taylor.
Representative Scott, I mean, for one, the people knew you was not out there rioting. So let me just say that first and foremostly. But the fact that you're still facing misdemeanor charges, is this Daniel Cameron's office that is pursuing charges against you? And I hope that these charges get dropped. They shouldn't have been brought in the first place. But is this his office doing this?
It's not Daniel Cameron's office. It's County Attorney Mike O'Connell here in Louisville. And yes, he was pursuing, well, the police arrested us and gave us these charges. And so I just give credit to the people across Louisville, across Kentucky, and across this country who contacted his office. Kim, on the first night, so many people called the phone line that it shut down the phone. And the night before we were arraigned this week, so many people emailed his office that it broke the link on the contact form to say, drop these charges, these absurd charges on all of the protesters. And so, yes, the county attorney did drop the felony charges against us, but we do still have the 2 misdemeanor charges, and we go to court November 16th to fight those charges as well. So we're going to be calling on people to do the same thing. Contact County Attorney Mike O'Connell and tell him to drop all those misdemeanor charges against the protesters.
Representative Scott, when we spoke last, we talked about what happens next. Where does this movement in Louisville and really nationally, but Louisville specifically right now, what happens next? And when we spoke last, you talked to me about how the work was moving from protest to policy. What's on the ballot for Kentuckians and Louisvillians coming up in these next couple of weeks as we are so close to Election Day? What are some of the things that people need to be aware of that is available for Kentuckians to vote upon that are definitely important? It could be transformational or it could be changing policy for the good that people need to know that this is important that you vote on this.
That is such a good question, Kim. One of the issues that's a ballot amendment issue is around extending the terms of service for district court judges and the Commonwealth's attorney. So it's so important for people in Kentucky to understand that we have the opportunity to either say, yes, we want these folks to serve even longer terms in office, or no, we don't, because we want to make sure we can hold them accountable. And that's important because we know as activists and leaders that Judge Mary Shaw, who signed these death search warrants for Brianna Taylor, has got to go. We also know that we've got to make sure that no district court judge, no Commonwealth's attorney gets to serve 8 years when that means we have 8 years before we can truly hold them accountable.
And lastly, Representative Scott, before we let you go, it's important that multiple aspects of the work be happening at the same time. And there's lots of people out there who believe that the system is broken and it needs to be dismantled. And there's work happening there. But for people like yourself who are elected officials, who are, drafting and writing legislation and who are working within the system, talk to us about where that work stands for you, particularly what is the status of Brianna's law and what is the likelihood that you can get the legislature and eventually, hopefully, the governor to sign it and make it law?
So Brianna's Law for Kentucky is something that I worked on with her family's attorney, Sam Aguiar, and with the ACLU of Kentucky, in particular, Couture Heron, who helped to get Brianna's Law unanimously passed here in Louisville. So, it's something that I'm hopeful about because it comes from the people, it comes from community, and it's a piece of legislation that folks are owning, that they feel like they are a part of. I mean, we have 4,000 people who have signed on as community co-sponsors of the law. And so, Kim, just very quickly, what the bill would do is it would say that we're ending no-knock search warrants across Kentucky. So no more no-knocks across Kentucky. It would also mandate that officers who are involved in deadly shootings and other violent incidences must comply with alcohol and drug testing. And it also states that when issuing or serving a warrant, that 5 minutes before and 5 minutes after, police must have on and turn on their body-worn cameras. So that's Brianna's Law for Kentucky. I have already written to the Speaker of the House to ask for a hearing this year before the regular session convenes so that we can have the conversation we need to have around it. And because of the people of Kentucky, I'm confident that the bill will be heard in committee when we come back in January 2021. And the people are going to have to continue their advocacy so that the bill will pass. And of course, we're going to have to apply pressure to the governor so that he signs Brianna's Law so that her name will forever be etched in Kentucky's revised statutes.
That's incredible. I want to thank you so much for joining us. We've been speaking with the only Black woman who is elected to the Kentucky State Legislature, Representative Attica Scott. She represents Louisville and the surrounding area. She is a freedom fighter. She puts her body on the line and she's going to work every day. I'm not going to talk too bad about your colleagues in the State House, but I can only imagine what you have experienced while working on behalf of your people in the Kentucky State Legislature. So I salute you. We thank you so much. And anything that we can do to amplify anything that you're doing, please let us know. We would love to have you back on anytime.
Thank you so much, Kim. I appreciate you.
If the police killed Breonna Taylor, we knew that we were not exempt. Representative Attica Scott there, a G amongst G's. Guys, that is the first episode of Burn It Down with Kim Brown. We appreciate y'all coming over to watch. Shout out to all the familiar faces and names that we saw in the comments, and join us again on Friday, 5 p.m. live right here for Burn It Down. Please also go to our designated YouTube channel. It's Burn It Down with Kim Brown. I need you to hit subscribe. I need you to hit like. I need you to do all those wonderful things to show us that you want us to keep going. So do that for me, and I will see you all Friday. See you later. Bye.